Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Chapter 15. Executive Orders. The year is 1942. Henry woke the next morning to the delightful smell of sinbeng, baked sesame buns, a breakfast favorite of his father's, and a real treat since sugar coupons were in short supply. At the table, his father sat dressed in his finest suit. Actually, his only suit. He'd had the dark gray number custom made by a tailor who'd just moved here from Hong Kong. Henry sat and listened to his father read from the daily newspaper, citing each new arrest of Japanese locals, all of them now bound for federal prison. Henry didn't understand. They were taking school teachers and businessmen, doctors and fishmongers. The arrests seemed random, and the charges were vague. His father sounded satisfied. Small battles won in a larger conflict. Henry blew on his honey-brown sesame bun, right from the oven, cooling it as best he could. He watched his father, who seemed engrossed in an article, wondering about Keiko and the arrest at the Black Elks Club. His father turned to show the story to Henry. All Henry could tell was that it was written in Chinese, a message from the Bing Kung Benevolent Association. Their chop, a stamp of their name, was evident at the bottom. "This is important news for us, Henry," his father explained in Cantonese. Henry finally took a bite and nodded, listening and chewing. "Do you know what an executive order is?" Henry had a vague idea, but, forbidden to answer in his father's native tongue, he simply shook his head no. "But you're going to tell me, aren't you?" "It's a very important declaration, like when Sun Yat-sen proclaimed January 1st, 1912 as the first day of the first year of the Republic of China." Henry had heard his father speak of the Republic of China on many occasions, even though his father hadn't set foot on Chinese soil since he was a young man. It had been years, back when he was Henry's age, and he'd been sent to finish his Chinese schooling in Canton. Father also spoke in reverent, worshipful tones of the late Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary who brought about a government of the people. Henry fancied the name Dr. Sun. It sounded like someone Superman would do battle with. His father had devoted most of his life to nationalist causes, all aimed at furthering the three people's principles proclaimed by the late Chinese president. So naturally, as Henry slowly grasped the point of his father's enthusiasm in these small local conflicts with Japanese Americans, it was mixed with a fair amount of confusion and contradiction. Father believed in a government of the people, but was wary of who those people were. "President Roosevelt just signed Executive Order 9102, which creates the War Relocation Authority. This is in addition to Executive Order 9066, which gives the United States power to designate new military areas." Like a new base or army fort, Henry thought, looking at the clock to make sure he wouldn't be late to school. "Henry, the entire West Coast has been designated as a military area." Henry listened, not understanding what this meant. "Half of Washington, half of Oregon, and most of California are now under military supervision." "Why?" Henry asked in English. His father must have understood the word, or maybe he just felt like Henry should know. "It says, I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders." Henry's father paused, doing his best to read it correctly in Cantonese. "To prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded. And with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War may impose in his discretion." Henry gulped down the last bite of his sesame bun. The executive order might have been in German for all he cared. The war was everywhere. He'd grown up with it. The presidential memorandum didn't seem out of the ordinary. "They can exclude anyone. They can exclude us, or German immigrants." His father looked at Henry, setting the letter down. "Or the Japanese." That last part worried Henry, about Keiko and her family. He looked out the window, barely noticing his mother. She'd come in with a pair of kitchen shears and cut the stem off the starfire lily he'd bought for her days ago, placing it back in its vase on their tiny kitchen table. They can't take them all away. What would happen to the strawberry farms on Vashon Island and the sawmill on Brainbridge? What about the fishermen? She said. Henry listened to their conversation in Cantonese as if it were coming from a distant radio station. Huh? Plenty of Chinese workers, plenty of colored workers. They so short on labor, even Boeing hiring Chinese now. Todd Shipyards is hiring and paying the same wage as Caucasian, his father said, smiling. Henry grabbed his book bag and headed for the door, wondering what might happen to Keiko if her father was arrested. He didn't even know what her father did to earn a living, but it didn't really matter now. Henry, you forgetting your lunch, his mother said. He told her he wasn't hungry, in English. She looked at Henry's father, puzzled. She didn't understand. Neither of them did. Henry walked past the corner on South Jackson. It was quiet and empty without Sheldon there to send him off. Henry was happy that his friend had found a job up the street, but having Sheldon around was like an insurance policy. No bully who followed Henry home made it past Sheldon's corner and his protective eye. In class that day, Mrs. Walker told everyone that their classmate, Will Whitworth, would be gone for the rest of the week. His father had been killed while serving on board the USS Marblehead. Japanese dive bombers struck his convoy near Borneo in the Makassar Strait. Henry didn't know where that was, but it sounded like someplace warm, tropical, and far away. He wished he was there as he felt the eyes of his classmates drill into him, tiny, piercing darts of accusation. Henry had had only one run-in with Will, and it was earlier in the year. Will seemed to fancy himself a war hero, doing his part to fight the Yellow Menace on the home front, even if it was only on the playground after school. Despite the black eye Will had given him, Henry genuinely felt sorry for him when he heard this news. How could he not? Fathers weren't perfect, but even a bad one seemed better than no father at all, at least in Henry's eyes. When lunchtime mercifully approached, Henry was excused. He ran, then walked, then ran again, down the hall and into the cafeteria kitchen. Keiko wasn't there. Instead, Denny Brown, one of Chaz's friends, stood there wearing a white apron, ladle in hand. He sneered at Henry, like a rat caught in a trap. What are you looking at? Mrs. Beatty stomped around the kitchen, patting herself, trying to find where she'd left her matches. Henry, this is Denny. He'll be subbing for Keiko. He got caught stealing from the school store, so Vice Principal Silverwood wants me to put him to work. Henry watched mortified. Keiko was gone. His kitchen haven was now occupied by one of his tormentors. Mrs. Beatty called off her search for a pack of matches and lit her cigarette on the stove's pilot light, then grumbled something about staying out of trouble as she wandered off to eat her lunch. At first, Henry had to listen to Denny grumble about being caught, getting kicked off flag duty, and cornered into working in the kitchen, forced to do the work of a Japanese girl. But when the lunch bell rang and hungry kids rolled in, Denny's attitude changed as they smiled and chatted him up. They all wanted him to serve them, holding back their trays, leering suspiciously at Henry as they passed. To them, Henry thought, we're at war, and I'm the enemy. He didn't wait for Mrs. Beatty to get back. He set his scoop down, removed his apron, and walked away. He didn't even return to his classroom. He left his books and his homework, passing down the hall and out the front door. In the distance, in the direction of Nihonmachi, he noticed small plumes of smoke disappearing in the gray afternoon sky.